What happens when the most powerful Lycan in history rejects the fiercest alpha females for a maid who hasn't spoken a single word in 10 years? History called it a scandal. The packs called it a curse. But the truth behind King Cedric's choice is bloodier than any legend. In the year of 1452, the kingdom of Ethelgard was a brutal, unforgiving realm ruled by fang, claw, and the ancient laws of the Lycans. At the apex of this food chain sat King Cedric of House Hallowell. He was a rarity, a white Lycan. Born once every few centuries, white Lycans were monstrously large, possessing strength that could snap a full-grown alpha's spine with a single strike, and a terrifying, unstable fury that constantly threatened to consume them. To keep his beast anchored to his humanity, the elders of the High Council decreed that Cedric needed a mate. Not just any mate, but a Luna strong enough to withstand his volatile nature. Thus the Grand Convocation was announced. Decrees were dispatched by Raven and Rider to every corner of the kingdom, from the frozen peaks of the northern ridge to the fertile valleys of Oakhaven. Every eligible female of noble blood was summoned to the citadel of Frosthold. Over 3,000 women answered the call. Among the caravans traveling the muddy, treacherous roads to the capital was the opulent carriage of House Croft. Inside sat Lady Seraphina Croft, a high-ranking alpha female whose beauty was as renowned as her cruelty. She was a favored candidate, boasting a lineage of fierce warriors and a dowry of rich lands. But this story is not about Seraphina. It is about the girl huddled in the freezing rain at the back of the baggage wagons, wrapped in a threadbare cloak, holding onto a small wooden box of mending supplies. Her name was Genevieve. Genevieve was an Ômega. In Lycan society, Ômegas were often revered as peacekeepers and nurturers, but Genevieve had the misfortune of being born to the disgraced House of Ashdown. 10 years prior, her parents had been falsely accused of treason by Lord Reginald Croft, Seraphina's father. Genevieve had been forced to watch her parents' execution in the courtyard of her own home. The trauma of that night had stolen her voice. She had not uttered a single word since she was 8 years old. Stripped of her titles and pack, she became a ward, a glorified slave, to the very family that had orchestrated her ruin. For a decade, Genevieve had been invisible. She was the shadow who scrubbed the blood from Seraphina's training leathers, the ghost who brushed her mistress's hair until her own hands bled. She was entirely unremarkable to the Lycan eye. Small, painfully thin, her scent masked by the harsh lye soap she used for laundering. As the Croft caravan finally breached the towering iron gates of Frosthold, the capital was a chaotic sea of color and noise. Thousands of hopeful brides paraded through the streets, dressed in spun silk, heavy velvets, and pelts of conquered beasts. They carried themselves with predatory grace, baring their necks in submission to the castle while snapping at their rivals. The air was thick, choking even, with the heavy, clashing perfumes and pheromones of thousands of desperate alphas and betas, all trying to outshine one another to catch the nose of the White King. Genevieve, shivering and exhausted, slipped unnoticed through the servants' entrance, tasked with preparing Seraphina's chambers for the month-long courtship trials. She had no illusions about her place in this grand theatre. She was a silent spectator, a broken Ômega whose only goal was survival. But fate, and the primal instincts of a white Lycan, had a far more treacherous plan. Within the high walls of the citadel, King Cedric was losing his mind. The sheer volume of women, the suffocating cloud of artificial floral scents, and the desperate, cloying ambition radiating from the great hall made his inner wolf thrash with violent agitation. His advisers, Meister Gregory and Duke Arlo Penson, urged him to at least make an appearance at the welcoming banquet. "You must choose, your grace," Meister Gregory pleaded, walking briskly beside the towering king down the vaulted stone corridors. "Lady Seraphina of House Croft is a pristine match, or perhaps Lady Eleanor Belmont, strong hips, pure alpha blood." Cedric paused, his ice-blue eyes flashing with a predatory, golden light. "They smell of desperation and deception, Gregory," Cedric growled, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that vibrated through the stone floor. "They do not want me. They want the crown. If I take one of them to my bed, my beast will likely tear them apart before morning." The convocation was meant to save him, but Cedric felt more like a thawed animal than ever before. He did not know that the very anchor his soul desperately cried out for was currently on her hands and knees in the lower scullery, quietly scrubbing mud from a pair of riding boots. The first week of the grand convocation was a grueling display of vanity. There were grand hunts, lavish banquets, and martial tournaments designed for the women to showcase their strength, fertility, and grace. Lady Seraphina was dazzling, dominating the hunts and capturing the attention of the High Council. She made sure Cedric saw her at every turn, flashing her perfect teeth and leaning in to let her rich, spicy scent waft toward him. Cedric remained cold, his massive frame slouched on his obsidian throne, a portrait of lethal boredom. On the night of the Blood Moon feast, the tension in the citadel reached a breaking point. The great hall was an ocean of dancing Lycans. Genevieve had been ordered to remain in the darkened, labyrinthine gardens outside the hall, tasked with guarding Seraphina's heavy winter furs so they would not be stolen or soiled. It was a cruel punishment. The mountain air was biting, and the snow was beginning to fall heavily. Genevieve wrapped her thin arms around herself, hiding beneath the sweeping branches of an ancient weeping willow. She watched the warm glow of the stained glass windows, listening to the roaring laughter and the clinking of gold goblets. She felt a profound, hollow loneliness, a deep ache in her chest that she had long ago learned to swallow. But the peace of the snowy garden was shattered by a rustle in the dark brush. Genevieve's keen Ômega senses, honed by years of surviving in a hostile household, picked up the scent first. It wasn't the scent of a noble guest. It was the rancid, feral stench of a rogue. Down the stone pathway, a small child had wandered out from the kitchens, a young pup, no older than 5, clutching a wooden toy. It was little Lord Leo, the orphaned nephew of Duke Penson. Out of the shadows lunged a massive, scarred rogue wolf, an assassin likely hired by a rival pack to strike at the Duke's bloodline during the chaos of the feast. The beast snarled, its jaws snapping toward the oblivious child. In that fraction of a second, thousands of high-ranking alpha females were just 50 yards away, dancing in their silk gowns, completely oblivious. Genevieve didn't think. She had no weapon, no alpha strength, and no voice to scream for the guards. But she was an Ômega, and the instinct to protect the young overrode her fear. Genevieve threw herself forward. She didn't attack the rogue. That would be suicide. Instead, she tackled little Leo. Curling her frail body entirely around the boy, shielding him with her own back just as the rogue's claws came down. Searing pain erupted across Genevieve's shoulder blades as the beast's claws tore through her thin dress and sliced into her flesh. She let out a silent, breathless gasp, her eyes squeezing shut. But she did not cry out. Instead, She released a concentrated wave of Ômega calming pheromones, a desperate biological defense mechanism meant to soothe the terrified child in her arms and confuse the attacker. The heavy oak doors of the great hall suddenly exploded outward. The commotion had finally caught the ear of the White King. Cedric bounded into the freezing night, his body already half-shifted, his eyes glowing like twin suns. Behind him spilled the royal guard and a crowd of shocked nobles, including Lady Seraphina. Cedric's massive hands seized the rogue by the throat. With a sickening crunch, he snapped the assassin's neck, tossing the lifeless body into the snow. The courtyard fell into a dead, terrified silence, save for the howling wind. Cedric stood panting, his chest heaving, the bloodlust of his inner beast threatening to take over. But then it hit him. Through the metallic tang of blood and the freezing snow, a scent cut through the air. It was the most intoxicating, pure scent he had ever encountered. It smelled like crushed pine needles, fresh rain, and a strange heart-breaking sorrow. It hit his senses like a physical blow, instantly sensing the raging monster in his head. Mate. The word echoed in his mind, ancient and undeniable. Mine. He turned slowly, tracking the scent. Seraphina, seeing the king's attention shift, realized the political opportunity. She had rushed out behind the guards and was standing only a few feet from where Genevieve lay, huddled over the child. Seraphina immediately stepped forward, dramatically dropping to her knees near the dead rogue. "Oh, your grace," Seraphina cried out, clutching her chest, projecting her own scent as hard as she could. "I saw the beast. I tried to intervene, to call for the guards to save the Duke's nephew. I was so terrified." The crowd murmured in awe of Lady Seraphina's supposed bravery. Maester Gregory nodded approvingly. "A courageous heart, my king. Fit for a Luna." Genevieve, trembling and bleeding heavily, slowly pushed herself up. She kept her head bowed, her hair falling over her face, terrified of the punishment she would face for bleeding on the pristine snow and drawing attention. She tried to drag herself backward into the shadows of the willow tree, yielding the stage to her mistress, just as she always did. She was a silent ghost. Nobody noticed her, except the king. Cedric ignored Seraphina completely. He stepped right past the beautiful Alpha, his heavy boots crunching in the snow. Seraphina's smile faltered, confusion twisting her delicate features. Cedric stopped before the patch of darkness under the willow tree. The crowd held its breath. The terrifying white Lycan, towering at 6.5 feet of pure muscle and lethal intent, slowly dropped to one knee in the blood-stained snow. He reached out a massive, trembling hand and gently, almost reverently, pushed the wet hair away from Genevieve's pale, frightened face. She flinched, bracing for a blow, her wide, terrified eyes finally meeting his glowing golden ones. "You," Cedric whispered, his voice cracking with an emotion that shook the very foundations of the citadel. He didn't care about her ragged clothes. He didn't care about her lack of a voice. The beast inside him purred, completely subdued, utterly devoted. He slipped his arms beneath her small frame and lifted her effortlessly against his chest, uncaring as her blood stained his royal white tunic. "Guards," Cedric commanded, his voice echoing with absolute, terrifying authority as he glared at the shocked crowd. "Summon the royal healer. If this woman perishes, I will burn this entire kingdom to the ground." The royal infirmary of Frosthold smelled of bitter yarrow, sterile linen, and the heavy metallic tang of blood. For 3 days and 3 nights, The kingdom of Ethelgard held its collective breath. Inside the highest tower, King Cedric had barred the heavy oaken doors, refusing entry to his council, his generals, and the thousands of furious noblewomen who still camped within the citadel's walls. The only person allowed in the room was the ancient royal healer, Madame Beatrice. On a massive canopy bed, draped in white furs, lay Genevieve. Her fever had broken on the second night, but the deep lacerations across her back from the rogue's claws were slow to heal, hindered by her fragile Ômega constitution. Yet, she was not alone. The terrifying white Lycan king, a warlord who had slaughtered entire rebel armies without a second thought, sat rigidly in a wooden chair beside her bed. He had not slept, nor had he eaten. His golden eyes were fixed entirely on the rise and fall of her chest, his massive hand gently engulfing her small, pale fingers. When Genevieve finally fluttered her eyes open, she panicked. Her heart hammered wildly against her ribs as she took in the opulent surroundings, completely foreign to a scullery maid. She tried to scramble backward, a silent gasp tearing at her dry throat, fully expecting to be struck for daring to sleep in the king's bed. "Peace, little bird." Cedric's voice was a low, resonant purr, vibrating with a desperate gentleness that commanded her fear to instantly evaporate. "You are safe. The beast is dead. You are under my protection." Genevieve stared at him, her wide hazel eyes trembling with disbelief. She pointed a shaking finger at her own chest, then gestured to the door, mouthing the word, "Mistress." She had to return to Lady Seraphina. The punishment for abandoning her duties would be severe. Cedric's jaw clenched, his facial muscles ticking as a dangerous growl vibrated in his chest. "Lady Seraphina Croft is nothing to you anymore. You are my mate. You are the Luna of Ethelgard." Tears welled in Genevieve's eyes. She shook her head frantically. She was a broken thing, a disgraced orphan of House Ashdown. She reached for a small piece of charcoal and a blank parchment resting on the bedside table, her hands trembling as she wrote her first communication to the king. "I have no voice, your grace. I have no pack, no land, no power. I cannot be what you need." Cedric read the script, his expression softening into profound sorrow. He knelt beside the bed, bringing himself to her eye level. "My beast has raged against the bars of my mind for 20 years, Genevieve. It screamed for blood, for dominance, for war. But when I smell your scent, it sleeps, it rests. You do not need a voice to command me. Your soul speaks louder than any alpha in this citadel." But outside the barred doors, a storm was brewing. In the great hall, Lord Reginald Croft, Seraphina's father, was pacing furiously before the High Council. He slammed his fists onto the heavy stone table, glaring at Meister Gregory and Duke Arlo Penson. "It is a mockery!" Lord Reginald roared, his alpha aura flaring in a suffocating display of dominance. "The king has been bewitched, an Ômega, a mute servant whose parents were executed for treason against the crown. This violates everything our society stands for. She cannot lead armies. She cannot birth a strong, white Lycan heir." Seraphina stood behind her father, dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief, playing the victim. "I tried to save her, my lords," she lied flawlessly, her voice dripping with venomous sweetness. "I tried to pull her away from the rogue, but she is frail. She is broken. If she becomes Luna, the neighboring packs will see Ethelgard as weak. They will invade before the first snow melts. Meister Gregory, bound by tradition and deeply concerned about the kingdom's stability, slowly nodded. He pulled a massive, dust-covered tome from the center of the table. "Lord Croft speaks a harsh truth," Gregory murmured, flipping the heavy parchment pages. "According to the Codex of the First Bite, a mate bond is sacred, but the title of Luna must be earned, not given. If the prospective Luna is deemed unfit by a reigning Alpha Lord, she must face the trial of the blood matrimony." Duke Penson, whose nephew Leo had been saved by Genevieve, narrowed his eyes. "You would send a battered Ômega to face a trial of dominance. It is a death sentence, Reginald, and you know it." "It is the law," Reginald spat. "If she cannot assert her dominance and prove her worth, the bond must be severed, and the king must choose a true alpha to stand by his side. Let my daughter challenge her." The council voted. Tradition won over mercy. The decree was written and slipped beneath the door of the royal infirmary. When Cedric read the parchment, a roar of sheer, unadulterated fury shattered the stained glass windows of the tower. He turned to tear the heavy doors off their hinges, ready to slaughter the entire council. But a small, cold hand wrapped around his wrist. Cedric turned, his eyes glowing a violent, murderous gold, his fangs fully descended. Yet Genevieve did not flinch. She stood on her bare feet, shivering in an oversized tunic, her back wrapped in heavy bandages. She looked at the king, then at the decree on the floor. She squeezed his wrist, a silent transmission of pure, calming Ômega energy flowing from her skin to his. She picked up her charcoal and wrote a single word. When? The courtyard of Frosthold was transformed into an ancient arena. Torches burned fiercely against the encroaching twilight, casting long, menacing shadows across the snow. Thousands of onlookers packed the balconies and battlements, their breath pluming in the freezing air. The silence was deafening, thick with anticipation and cruelty. At the northern end of the arena stood Lady Seraphina Croft. She was dressed in crimson leather armor, her golden hair braided tightly against her skull. She stretched her limbs, her eyes fixed with murderous intent on the opposite side of the courtyard. She was not just going to challenge the Ômega. She was going to rip her throat out. The law dictated that the trial ended only in submission or death. At the southern end stood King Cedric, restrained by the heavy iron chains of the High Council. It was a ceremonial binding, meant to prevent the Alpha King from interfering in his mate's trial. His massive muscles strained against the metal, his eyes practically bleeding gold as he watched the heavy wooden gates open. Out stepped Genevieve. A collective murmur of disgust and pity rippled through the crowd. She wore no armor, only a simple white linen dress that swallowed her small frame. Her bare feet stepped softly onto the blood-stained snow. She looked incredibly fragile, like a porcelain doll thrown into a wolf's den. "This is an insult to our bloodline," Seraphina shouted, her voice echoing off the stone walls. She began to stalk forward, her body trembling as she half-shifted, her nails elongating into lethal black claws. "Submit now, little mouse, and I might let you live out your days, scrubbing my floors." Genevieve did not retreat. She stood perfectly still in the center of the arena, the winter wind whipping her dark hair around her pale face. Maester Gregory raised a silver horn and blew the deafening note to begin the trial. Seraphina lunged. She moved with blinding speed, a blur of crimson and fury, aiming a deadly strike right at Genevieve's chest. The crowd gasped. Cedric roared, tearing one of the iron chains straight out of the stone wall. But Genevieve did not fight back. She did not raise her fists. Instead, she closed her eyes, planted her feet, and unleashed everything she had. Omegas in Lycan society were misunderstood. They were thought to be weak because they lacked the physical aggression of alphas. But an Omega's true power lay in the mind, in the deep, primal currents of the pack dynamic. Genevieve, pushed to the brink of death, released a concentrated, overwhelming wave of Omega dominance. It was not a physical blow. It was a psychological shock wave. The scent of crushed pine and deep, crushing sorrow exploded across the arena. It hit Seraphina mid-leap. The alpha female's brain, hardwired by millions of years of evolution to protect and submit to a distressed, high-ranking Omega, suddenly misfired violently. The sheer density of Genevieve's sorrow and peace hit Seraphina like a solid wall of iron. Seraphina crashed into the snow, mere inches from Genevieve's feet. She gasped for air, clutching her head, her alpha instincts utterly paralyzed by the overwhelming biological command to cease aggression. The more Seraphina tried to fight it, the more her own nervous system rebelled. She began to violently dry heave, completely subdued, without Genevieve ever lifting a single finger. The crowd was stunned into absolute, breathless silence. They had never witnessed an Omega overpower an alpha. Genevieve opened her eyes. She looked down at her tormentor of 10 years, feeling no malice, only profound pity. She slowly lifted her foot and gently placed it on the back of Seraphina's neck, the ultimate gesture of Lycan submission. Seraphina whimpered, utterly broken by her own biology, and pressed her face into the snow, submitting to the silent girl. Before Meister Gregory could announce the victor, the heavy doors of the citadel burst open once more. Duke Arlo Penson marched into the arena, flanked by 10 heavily armed royal guards. Dragging between them was Lord Reginald Croft, bloodied and bound in heavy iron shackles. "Halt!" Duke Penson bellowed, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "The trial is over, but justice has just begun." Cedric, having broken the rest of his chains, immediately blurred across the courtyard, placing his massive body protectively in front of Genevieve. He snarled at the Duke, demanding an explanation. "Your Grace." Duke Penson bowed deeply, tossing a heavy leather satchel onto the snow. "Following the attack on my nephew during the Blood Moon Feast, my men intercepted a courier attempting to flee the kingdom. The courier carried ledgers and letters bearing the seal of House Croft. Lord Reginald struggled against his captors, his face pale with terror. "Lies! It is a conspiracy." Duke Penson ignored him, turning to the king and the High Council. "The rogue who attacked the citadel was hired by Lord Reginald Croft, paid in gold to assassinate my nephew and weaken my position on the council. But that is not his only crime." The Duke pulled a yellowed, fragile parchment from the satchel. "I hold here the original, unaltered documents from 10 years ago. The treason of House Ashdown was a fabrication. Lord Reginald forged the letters that led to the execution of Genevieve's parents, all to seize their fertile lands and secure a monopoly on the kingdom's grain supply." A shockwave of horrified whispers erupted from the balconies. The ultimate betrayal in Lycan society was shedding innocent pack blood for greed. Cedric's aura exploded. The air in the courtyard grew freezing cold as the white Lycan's fury manifested physically. He turned his terrifying, glowing gaze toward Lord Reginald. The Alpha Lord instantly dropped to his knees, weeping and begging for mercy. "You slaughtered innocents." Cedric's voice was no longer human. It was the voice of an ancient, vengeful god. "You enslaved my mate. You dared to bring an assassin into my home." Cedric stepped forward, his claws fully unsheathed, but Genevieve reached out, her small hand gently grasping the back of his royal tunic. Cedric froze. He looked back at her. Genevieve shook her head. She gestured to Reginald, then pointed to the northern ridge, the desolate, freezing wastelands beyond the kingdom's borders. She did not want his blood. She wanted him banished, stripped of his wolf, his titles, and his dignity. To be a rogue in the harsh winter was a fate far worse and far more lingering than a quick death. Cedric stared at his mate, marveling at the boundless ocean of mercy within her battered soul. The beast inside him, which would have gleefully painted the courtyard with croft blood, bowed to her silent command. "Hear the judgment of your Luna," Cedric declared, his voice booming across the silent, awe-struck crowd. "Housecroft is dissolved. Their lands are returned to House Ashdown. Lord Reginald and his daughter are stripped of their packmarks. They are banished to the northern wastes. If they ever step foot in Ethelgard again, they will be hunted for sport." As the guards dragged the screaming, sobbing Crofts away, the courtyard fell silent once more. Cedric turned to Genevieve. The terrifying white Lycan king dropped to both knees in the bloody snow, bowing his head in total submission to the tiny, silent girl. Seeing their king yield, Duke Penson immediately knelt. Then Maester Gregory. Slowly, like a wave rolling across the ocean, thousands of alpha lords, fierce warriors, and noble women dropped to their knees in the snow, bowing their heads. Genevieve stood in the center of the kingdom, the winter wind catching her dark hair. She had not spoken a single word, yet she had conquered the most dangerous beast in history and brought an empire to its knees. She reached out, gently cupping Cedric's face, pulling him up to press her forehead against his. In the silent space between them, a golden, unbreakable bond settled into place. The kingdom of Ethelgard would never be the same, for it was finally ruled not by the fear of the wolf, but by the quiet, unbreakable heart of the Ômega. If you were captivated by Genevieve's silent strength and King Cedric's fierce loyalty, hit that like button and share this story with your fellow romance lovers. The world needs to know that true power doesn't always roar. Subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell so you never miss out on our thrilling werewolf dramas and epic fantasy tales. Drop a comment below telling us your favorite plot twist, and we will see you in the next epic video.